Hi, I'm Richard Hayes. On Christmas Eve, my son opened the massive front door of the house I paid off with 30 years of work and threw my only suitcase onto the frozen stone steps. My daughter stood right behind him, arms folded, smiling like someone who'd finally won a long, ugly game. "Let's see how you survive now, Dad," she said. And just like that, the world I built cracked clean in half. The cold hit me first, a hard metallic slap that stole my breath. My suitcase slid down one marble step, then another, landing beside the potted fir I planted the year Daniel was born. I stared at it, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to believe that the two children whose diapers I had changed, whose nightmares I soothed, whose futures I worked myself sick to secure, were the ones throwing me out of my own home. Behind them, inside the warm glow of the foyer, the life I had built went on without me. The garland we hung together last week sparkled. The fireplace crackled. A catered Christmas dinner waited on the table. Everything perfect, everything staged, everything suddenly no longer mine. "Come on," Daniel said, voice flat and rehearsed. "Don't drag this out." He didn't even meet my eyes. Neither did Lily. They just stood there side by side like a united front against a man who'd never once raised a hand to them. I took one step toward the door, instinct telling me to reason with them, to explain, to plead, but Daniel's hand shot out, blocking my path. "No, we're done," he said. "You need to leave. Tonight." I blinked at him, stunned. "Daniel, this is my house." "Was," he corrected. "You can't keep up anymore. You're holding us back, holding them back." I'd heard variations of this all year. "Dad, sell the car. It's too old." "Dad, you can't handle the finances anymore." Dad, why don't you move somewhere smaller?" "Dad, you're becoming a burden." But I never imagined they meant this. Lily lifted her phone, recording, because of course she was. I watched the little red light blink, capturing my humiliation for whatever audience she had cultivated in her curated, glossy life. "Just go, Dad," she said. "Spare us the guilt trip." Guilt trip. That was what she thought this was. When neither of them budged, I finally bent down and grabbed the handle of my suitcase. My fingers shook so badly I could hardly lift it. Whether from the cold or from the truth settling inside me, I couldn't tell. As I stepped backward into the freezing night, Daniel closed the door. Not slammed it. Not in rage. He closed it the way you close a cabinet or a drawer. A quiet final click. The kind of sound that tells you something is over. The alarm armed automatically. A sharp double beep I used to find comforting. Tonight it felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. I stood there for a long moment, letting the cold swallow the last traces of warmth from inside the house. My breath came out in uneven clouds. My ears burned. My hands felt like stone. Then I walked. Not because I had anywhere to go, but because standing still made me feel like I might crumble right there on the front steps. The night smelled like pine and distant smoke. Every house on the street glowed with Christmas lights. Families gathering, laughing, belonging. I used to belong. My suitcase wheels rattled over the pavement, echoing down the empty cul-de-sac. The fog was thickening, rolling in slow waves across the ground like it was trying to smother the whole neighborhood. I told myself I wasn't going to cry. I'm 63. I've lived through layoffs, divorce, my parents' deaths, 2 recessions, and 1 heart scare. I thought I knew pain, but nothing prepared me for the moment when you realize your children see you as something to be discarded. By the time I reached the small park near the church, my legs were trembling. I sat on the cold iron bench beneath the flickering street lamp. It buzzed softly above me, casting a sickly halo of light. Only then did my hands start to thaw enough for me to feel the sting. Only then did the tears finally come. Not loud, barely even noticeable, but enough to slip onto my cheeks and freeze in seconds. I pressed my hands to my face and whispered into the cold, "Why, Daniel? Why, Lily? What did I do so wrong?" No one answered, just the wind. I was about to stand and start walking again when I heard it. The slow dragging scrape of bare feet on concrete. I lifted my head. And there she was, an elderly woman, barefoot, trembling violently, skin turning a frightening shade of purple as she shuffled toward me through the fog. And what happened next changed everything. I thought the cold had made me hallucinate. No one could survive barefoot in weather like that. Not in the thick fog, not in that biting December air that cut straight through wool and bone. But she kept walking toward me, slow and deliberate, as if the night itself were pushing her forward. Her hair, long and silver white, whipped violently in the wind. Her thin nightgown fluttered around her ankles, already soaking with frost. Her skin, God, I will never forget her skin, was turning that dangerous bluish purple I'd seen once before, when I was a young man and a co-worker collapsed outside during a blizzard. The color of a body that's losing heat too fast. Every instinct in me flared. Concern, protectiveness, shock, but more than anything, recognition. Not of her, but of the state she was in. The state of being abandoned. She stopped a few feet from the bench, swaying slightly, staring at me with eyes that seemed too clear for someone on the edge of hypothermia. "Young man," she rasped. It startled me. I hadn't been called that in decades. "Do you know if any shelter still has room tonight?" she asked, voice cracking. I walked up from Burlingame. Everywhere is full. Burlingame. That was more than 5 miles away, barefoot, at her age. My heart clenched so hard it hurt. I don't know," I stammered. "I'm sorry. I don't have anywhere tonight either." She studied me for a long moment. Not pity, not judgment. Something quieter. Something like understanding. "Well," she said softly, lowering herself onto the bench. "It seems we're both between places." The metal was so cold that I heard her breath hitch when she touched it. She shivered violently, hands trembling in her lap, and that was when I saw it. Her feet bare, swollen, cracked, and purpled with cold. The sight made me inhale sharply. "Ma'am, you'll freeze like this," I whispered. She shrugged weakly, the gesture barely more than a twitch. "Cold is kinder than some things I've lived through." The way she said it, almost conversational, made something inside me break. We sat there in silence for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. The street lamp hummed above us. The fog thickened, wrapping the small park in a muted, ghostly bubble. In that strange, isolated pocket of the world, it was just the two of us. Two cast-offs sitting on a bench meant for parishioners waiting for Sunday service. I looked down at my coat. It wasn't much, just a thick winter parka I'd bought years ago. But it was the only thing keeping me from shivering like she was. And then I heard my son's voice echoing in my mind. "Don't drag this out. You're holding us back. Just go, Dad." And my daughters? "Try not to freeze." Something inside me hardened. Something else softened. Before I could second-guess myself, I stood, shrugged off my coat, and placed it over the woman's shoulders. Her entire body flinched when the warmth hit her. And then she let out a quiet, broken gasp, like someone who had forgotten what warmth felt like. She clutched the coat tightly, fingers digging into the fabric as if it were the only solid thing in a world determined to swallow her. "No," she protested weakly. "You'll freeze." "I'll be all right," I lied. "You need it more than I do." She lifted her face toward mine. Her eyes, sharp, pale blue, penetrating, locked onto mine with a clarity I still struggle to describe. There was recognition there, not of my identity, but of something deeper. The moment when a person chooses kindness despite being stripped bare. "What is your name?" she asked. "Richard," I said, my voice cracking. She repeated it under her breath as if tasting it. "Richard." Then she reached out and took both my hands in hers. Her fingers were ice cold, frighteningly so, but her grip was unexpectedly firm. She held my hands as though anchoring both of us to something steady. "Thank you, Richard Hayes," she whispered. "Kindness like yours is rarer than diamonds." Diamonds. Her voice echoed oddly on that word, but I didn't understand why then. Before I could speak, she released my hands, stood with a steadiness she hadn't shown before, and looked at me with something like sorrow or promise. I couldn't tell. Then she turned and walked away, barefoot into the fog, dissolving into the grey silence like a ghost returning to whatever world she came from. I wanted to call after her. I wanted to follow, but my legs wouldn't move, so I sat back down, coatless, shivering violently now, feeling the cold sink straight through my sweater, straight into my bones. My teeth chattered so hard it made my jaw ache. But strangely, the ache in my chest eased just a little. For the first time since Daniel closed that door, I didn't feel entirely alone. The quiet wasn't as suffocating. The fog wasn't as hostile. Something had shifted inside me. Something small and fragile but real. A spark. A reminder that I still had something to offer the world, even if my own children didn't want it. I don't know how long I stayed on that bench. Maybe half an hour, maybe 3 hours. Time fogged over like everything else, but eventually when my fingers were numb and my lips tingling, I forced myself to stand. I walked toward the cheap motel on the edge of town, the one with flickering neon and weekly rates available in red plastic letters. My feet burned as blood tried to circulate through them again. My shoulders trembled without my coat. Every breath felt like inhaling knives, but I made it. The motel clerk didn't look up when I entered. He never does. He just slid the key across the counter with a sigh that suggested even being mildly aware of me was too much effort. Room 112, ground floor. The carpet smelled like cigarette burns and spilled beer, and the heater rattled like it was dying. But it was warm, and that was enough. I fell onto the bed fully dressed, too exhausted to bother peeling off my shoes. My fingers twitched uncontrollably, a sign the cold had cut deeper than I realized. For a long time I simply stared at the water-stained ceiling, trying to understand the last few hours. My children had thrown me away. A stranger had shown me more humanity in 5 minutes than they had in years. And somewhere in the fog walked a barefoot woman who seemed to know more about me than I knew about myself. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A number I didn't recognize. Private caller. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, I answered. Mr. Hayes? A crisp female voice said. This is Grace O'Neill, calling on behalf of Mrs. Eleanor Calloway. My stomach tightened. The name meant nothing to me. Yes, I croaked. Mrs. Calloway would like to meet you. Now. Who? I asked, genuinely confused. You'll understand soon, Grace replied. A car is already waiting outside your room. A car, I repeated. Please step outside, Mr. Hayes. Mrs. Calloway insists. The line went dead. I sat there for a full minute listening to the heater rattle, to my heartbeat thumping too loudly in my chest, to the echo of my own name spoken by that woman on the bench. Richard Hayes. I stood legs stiff from cold and exhaustion and crossed the room. When I opened the door, I froze. The motel parking lot, usually full of beat-up sedans and rusted trucks, was filled with 19 identical black luxury sedans. Engines purring softly, windows tinted, paint gleaming like obsidian under the buzzing neon sign. 19. Silent. Perfectly aligned. The lead car's rear door swung open by itself. My breath caught. In that moment, I knew my life had split cleanly into before and after, and the barefoot woman was at the center of the divide. I stood in the doorway of room 112, the cheap neon buzzing overhead, staring at the line of 19 identical black sedans like they had materialized from another world. For a long moment, I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My brain couldn't reconcile the sight, not after the night I'd had. Hours earlier, I'd been shivering on a park bench, stripped of dignity, of family, of home. Now there was a fleet of luxury cars parked in front of a motel that smelled like wet carpet and despair. It felt like stepping from one universe into another without warning. The rear door of the first sedan remained open, waiting. No driver stepped out. No voice called my name. Just the silent invitation. My instincts warred inside me. Caution, curiosity, fear, hope. Hope. That dangerous little ember I thought the cold had extinguished. I took a step forward, then another. By the time I reached the car, my breath fogged the glass. I leaned slightly to see inside. She was there, the barefoot woman from the fog. But she wasn't barefoot now, and she wasn't freezing. She wasn't even fragile. She sat upright, elegant, composed, wrapped in a flawless camel hair coat, hair pulled back into a sleek chignon, skin warm and radiant, diamonds catching the dim light like shards of captured ice. Her transformation was so complete it bordered on impossible. She turned her head toward me and smiled. The same small, knowing smile she'd given me on the bench, but now illuminated by warmth instead of pain. "Hello again, Richard," she said softly, as though greeting an old friend. My knees nearly buckled. Before I could speak, the door closed behind me with a soft pneumatic hiss. The car pulled forward before I fastened the seatbelt. A partition rose silently, sealing us off from the driver. My mouth felt dry. I don't understand." "That's all right," she said. "You will." Her voice was steady now, no rasp, no tremor, a woman fully in command of her world. The contrast to the shivering barefoot figure from the park was staggering. "You weren't..." I swallowed. "You weren't homeless?" "No," she said, "not for a long time." She folded her hands in her lap and studied me with those sharp, pale eyes, the same eyes that had pierced through the fog hours earlier. "But I once was," she added. "A long time ago." My breath hitched. There it was, the thread that connected us. "Why were you out there?" I asked. "Why like that, barefoot? In that cold?" A faint smile touched her lips, one filled with memory and something like pain. "Every Christmas Eve for the past 25 years, she said. "I leave my estate with no identification, no phone, no protection that's visible. I walk until I find someone who has nothing to gain and still chooses kindness." I stared at her, stunned. She continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "Most years I return home disappointed." My throat tightened. "But this year," she said, "I found you." The words should have comforted me. Instead, they felt heavy, like being handed something I didn't yet know how to carry. "Why me?" I whispered. "I'm nobody." She tilted her head, studying me with a gentleness that disarmed me. "No, Richard. You're a man who was thrown away by the very people you gave everything to, and still chose to give to a stranger." Her eyes softened. "There is nothing nobody about that." The car slowed. Through the tinted glass, I saw tall hedges, massive iron gates sweeping open without a sound, and a long driveway lined with old-growth redwoods. I'd lived in California my whole life, but I'd never been on a street like this. The house that emerged through the trees looked like something out of another century. A grand 1920s Tudor estate, its stone walls glowing golden in the warm exterior lights. My breath caught again. This wasn't wealth. This was legacy. The car stopped beneath a porte-cochere. A man in a dark suit opened my door without a word. When I stepped out, the air was warmer. Heaters hidden among the stone columns keeping the cold at bay. For a moment, I simply stood there, overwhelmed. The woman extended her hand as she stepped out with surprising steadiness for someone her age. "Come inside, Richard." My legs obeyed before my mind did. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and roses, not artificial fragrances, real ones. Logs crackled in a stone hearth big enough to stand in. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a private lake glimmering in the moonlight. "Please," she said, gesturing toward a cream-colored sofa. "Sit." I lowered myself cautiously, afraid I might stain the upholstery with my motel clothes. She sat across from me, framed by firelight, her presence simultaneously delicate and commanding. "My name," she said, "is Eleanor Calloway." I blinked. The name was familiar, but from where? "My late husband founded Calloway Commercial Realty," she explained. "When he passed 12 years ago, I bought out the shareholders and took the company private. The profits funded the Calloway Family Foundation." The name hit me then. I had seen it on plaques throughout the Bay Area, community centers, scholarship buildings, shelters. "We finance and operate thousands of housing units across the state," she said. "Our annual distribution is roughly $120 million. My mind couldn't hold the numbers. It felt indecent to be hearing them while wearing a sweater I'd slept in and shoes with cracked soles. "But you—" I stopped. "Why test people like that?" Her eyes drifted toward the fire. The flames reflected in them like liquid gold. "Because," she said quietly, "I know what it feels like to sit alone on Christmas Eve, stripped of your worth by the people who should have protected you." My breath caught. "I was 29 when my father threw me out with nothing but the clothes I was wearing," she said. "Not unlike what your children chose to do tonight." My chest tightened painfully. The parallel was uncanny. "It took me years to rebuild my life," she continued. "Years to understand that cruelty from family scars deeper than any hardship the world can offer." She leaned forward just slightly. "And I promised myself that if I ever had the means, I would make sure no one who chose kindness in their darkest moment remained forgotten." Silence fell between us, warm and heavy. "Richard," she said, voice steady, "I'm offering you something few people ever receive. A way forward. Not charity, not pity. A purpose." I stared at her, unable to speak. "A room here," she said. "Food. Stability. A chance to learn, to grow, to rebuild." Rebuild. The word echoed inside me like a bell. "And if after a year you are the person I believe you are," she continued, "I will offer you something more. A place in this foundation. A role in deciding how we help those who have nothing. A seat at a table built for compassion, not exploitation." My mouth went dry. I had spent a lifetime providing for others, only to be thrown out like expired milk. The thought of being needed again, not used, not tolerated, but needed, shook me to my core. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. She smiled gently. "Say you'll stay." My eyes burned. I blinked hard, ashamed of tears in a house like this. I don't know if I deserve something like this." "Kindness is not about deserving," she said softly. "It is about choosing." She extended her hand toward me, palm open, steady. "So, Richard Hayes, will you choose to come home tonight?" Home. The word almost undid me. I stared at her hand for a long, trembling moment. My son's voice echoed in my mind. My daughter's laughter. The slam of the door. The cold. The park bench. The loneliness that had nearly swallowed me whole. And then I saw her, barefoot in the fog, trembling, suffering, still offering me a gaze filled with humanity. I reached out and placed my hand in hers. I moved into the east wing of Eleanor Calloway's estate on a Monday morning that smelled of wet earth and blooming roses. I didn't bring much with me. Just the old duffel my son threw onto the steps, the same clothes I'd been wearing when she found me, and a heart still raw from everything I had lost. But from the moment I stepped into that wing, past the French doors, past the soft cream walls, past the view of her rose garden stretching like a sea of color, I felt something I hadn't sensed in years. Possibility. Grace O'Neill, the woman who had called me from the motel, met me at the doorway. Tall, silver-haired, expression sharp as an ironed crease. She looked like she'd worked beside Eleanor for decades. She didn't waste a second on small talk. "Mr. Hayes," she said, handing me a thick leather binder. "Welcome to your new routine. Breakfast at 7, administrative orientation at 8, non-profit fundamentals at 9, reading assignments nightly. You'll report directly to Mrs. Calloway." Her tone made it clear this wasn't charity. It was employment, expectation, commitment, and strangely that steadied me. The first morning, I overslept by 4 minutes. Grace noticed. She didn't comment. She didn't have to. The slight arch of her eyebrow communicated everything. I tightened up after that, woke before dawn, showered, shaved, sat with a notebook open before breakfast even began. Then came the training. I had no idea how intense it would be. At 6 a.m., I walked the lake trail with a former Navy SEAL turned trainer named Mark. He wasn't there to build my body. He was there to restore my discipline. "Show up early," he said. "Show up honest. Everything else comes after." At 7:30 sharp, I joined Eleanor for breakfast, her reading the Financial Times, me trying not to look like a drowning man. She tested me constantly, sliding me articles about housing policy, ethics, tax rules for charitable trusts. "What do you see here, Richard?" she asked. Every morning the same question. Every morning I tried a little harder. At 9 a.m. the real battle began. Boardrooms. I sat beside her as billionaires argued over impact metrics, as analysts debated cost-benefit ratios, as program directors defended budgets line by line. I thought I was a smart man before, but this was a world of sharp elbows, sharper minds, and no patience for hesitation. And all the while, Eleanor whispered insights to me. "Watch that one. He's hiding fear behind numbers. Listen to what she didn't say." That question was a trap. Don't fall for it next time. She wasn't just teaching me philanthropy, she was teaching me people. Afternoons were spent in the Foundation's archive room, a quiet sunlit space filled with 2 decades of grant reports, proposals, failures, triumphs, and heartbreaks. I read everything. Sometimes hours passed before I realized I'd forgotten to blink. At night, when the estate grew still, I sat at the heavy oak desk in my new room and tried to absorb everything. Governance, budgeting, how to distinguish a genuine nonprofit from a polished scam, how to say no without destroying community trust, how to look at a spreadsheet and see lives behind the numbers. I had never worked so hard in my life. I had never felt so alive. Some nights, exhaustion won. I fell asleep with my face pressed to a financial statement. Other nights, doubt crept in like a cold draft. "You're too old for this. You're not smart enough for this. Your children threw you out because they saw the truth." But every time I stumbled, Eleanor appeared, sometimes literally. She walked into my study one night at 11 p.m., catching me staring helplessly at a section on capital gains tax for charitable endowments. "Stuck?" she asked. "Hopeless," I admitted. She smiled gently. "No, overwhelmed. There's a difference." She sat beside me, guiding me through the dense text until the fog in my mind cleared. When she finished, she closed the binder and placed her hand over mine. "Richard," she said softly, "the world has broken you more than once, but I've met broken men. You're not one of them. You're rebuilding." Her words lodged in my chest, warm and dangerous. I didn't know how much I needed to hear them until that moment. Weekends were the part that changed me the most. Grace drove me to shelters in Oakland, to food banks in San Jose, to veteran housing units in the Central Valley. I met men sleeping in their trucks, mothers fleeing violent homes, teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. For years, I'd lived in a comfortable bubble. A world of mortgage payments, grocery lists, and Christmas dinners I believed were normal. But walking through those buildings, talking to those people, seeing how close they lived to collapse, it humbled me. It awakened me. It carved new space inside me. One Saturday, after visiting a domestic violence shelter, I sat alone in the car and cried harder than I had the night my son threw me out. Not out of pity, but because I finally understood how fragile the line between secure and forgotten truly was. I had crossed that line. These people lived on it every day. And for the first time in a long time, I felt purpose in my chest, fierce, shaking, undeniable. By the end of the first month, I no longer recognized the man who had walked into this estate. Cold, discarded, ashamed. My spine felt straighter, my mind sharper, my mornings steadier. And Eleanor saw it too. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal board meeting where I dared to challenge a hedge fund director's proposal, she took me aside. "You were right," she said. I blinked. "About what?" "About everything." Then she smiled. The kind of smile a teacher saves for the moment a student stops surviving and starts becoming. "Richard," she said, "you're ready for the next stage." And I knew deep in my chest that my life wasn't being fixed. It was being rewritten. They came back into my life on a grey Thursday morning in October. The kind of morning where the sky hangs low and heavy, as if waiting for something to break. I was in my office on the 22nd floor of the Foundation's building, reviewing final notes for a new supportive housing project, when Grace knocked once and stepped inside. Her usually composed expression had a slight crack in it. "Richard," she said quietly, "your son and daughter are downstairs, no appointment." My heart stuttered. For a moment, all the months of growth, discipline, and healing seemed to evaporate, replaced by the memory of Daniel's cold voice and Lily's phone camera pointed at my humiliation. "They want to come up?" I asked. "They insisted," Grace replied. "Security called me first." I took a breath, a deep, steady, deliberate breath. "Send them up," I said. Grace hesitated for 3 seconds, long enough to let me know she didn't approve, then nodded and left. I stayed seated behind my desk, hands folded, watching the elevator numbers descend. 17, 18, 19. The tension tightened my chest. Not fear, not anger. Something heavier, the weight of finally facing what they had done to me. The doors opened. They stepped out looking nothing like the children who had thrown me out on Christmas Eve. Daniel wore a suit that didn't quite fit. Shoulders too wide, sleeves too long. His hair, once perfectly styled, was unkempt. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, the skin tight with worry. "Lily." God. My daughter, once polished and camera-ready, looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot and she wore no makeup, something I hadn't seen since she was a child. She clutched a cheap canvas tote bag like it contained the last pieces of her life. "Dad," she whispered. That single word nearly buckled me. But I didn't stand, didn't rush to comfort them, didn't offer forgiveness simply because they had finally learned fear. Instead, I gestured calmly to the chairs across from me. "Sit," I said. They did. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The distance between us felt like a canyon carved from years of entitlement, blindness, and choices they never imagined would break back toward them. Daniel cleared his throat. We're in trouble." I said nothing. He swallowed. "Everything's gone, Dad. Our savings, our investments, the house, everything. We made some decisions that didn't turn out." Lily's voice trembled. "We didn't know how fast it could fall apart." They fumbled through explanations. Bad investments, crypto losses, failed projects, burned bridges, creditors. Their words blurred together into one long confession of recklessness and panic. They were drowning, and they expected me to be the rope. "Dad," Daniel said, leaning forward, "we're going to be evicted in 6 weeks. We have nowhere else to go." Silence pressed on my ribs like a weight. "Please," Lily whispered, her voice cracking. "Just enough to help us get back on our feet. A few months. Anything." I watched them both. 2 grown adults who months earlier had laughed while pushing me into the cold. 2 people who had told themselves a story in which I was the burden, and they were the ones wronged by having to deal with me. I could see the desperation in their eyes now, and beneath it, the faint flicker of fear that maybe the door they slammed shut would not open again. "What about the money you inherited?" I asked quietly. Daniel flinched. Lily looked down. "It's gone," he muttered. "All of it." "All?" I repeated. He nodded shamefully. "Every last cent. The old version of me, the man they discarded, would have jumped in with solutions, rescue plans, fatherly reassurances they hadn't earned. But that man died on a park bench the night they closed the door." "Dad," Lily said, tears sliding down her cheeks, "we're sorry." The words hung in the air, fragile, trembling, late. I opened the black folder Grace had set on my desk earlier. Inside were 3 business cards. I placed them gently on the polished wood and slid them toward my children. They looked confused. The first card, a financial counselor specializing in post-bankruptcy recovery. The second, a free financial literacy course funded by our foundation. The third, a local therapist who accepted sliding scale clients. "These," I said, "are the resources the foundation offers to members of the public who have lost everything." Daniel stared at the cards as if they were something poisonous. Lily looked at me through tears. "That's it," she whispered. "After everything, that's all you're giving us?" I stood, and for the first time in my life, I looked at them not as my failures or my burdens, but simply as 2 people standing at the consequence of their own choices. "You had a home," I said softly. "You had security. You had me. But when I needed you, even for a single night, you turned your backs." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Dad, we were wrong." "I know," I said. "But wrong doesn't rebuild a life. Work does." Lily crumpled into quiet sobs. I walked to the door. "You're welcome to those resources," I said, "but I will not pay for the destruction you created. I won't be your safety net." Daniel hesitated, eyes burning with humiliation and something like panic. "We're your children," he said. "Isn't there anything left in you that wants to save us?" I met his gaze. "There is," I said, "but not enough to sacrifice myself again." Grace appeared behind them, silent and steady. "Please escort them down," I told her. My children stood slowly. Daniel's face was stone. Lily's was a rainstorm. Just before they stepped into the hallway, Lily whispered, barely audible, Do you hate us now?" I felt the answer rise in my chest, sharp, instinctual, honest. "No," I said. "I just finally love myself enough not to let you hurt me again." The door closed. Their footsteps faded. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, my heart felt quiet. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just free. The sky over East Palo Alto was the color of cold steel the morning we opened Second Home. Not a bright morning, not a warm one, but a determined one. The kind of sky that matches the weight of a beginning that had to be earned, not given. From my office window on the 2nd floor, I watched families gather in the courtyard below. Mothers holding toddlers, veterans leaning on canes, teenagers wrapped in hoodies, people who had lived too long on the edge of survival now standing on the threshold of something better. I adjusted my tie, black, simple, the same one I wore the day Eleanor offered me a new life, and exhaled slowly. Today wasn't about me, but today was because of me. That realization sat strangely in my chest. Grace appeared beside me without knocking. "They're ready for you," she said. I nodded, but she didn't move. She looked at me with a softness I wasn't used to from her. "You did this, Richard," she said. "All of this." I swallowed hard. Compliments still felt foreign in my mouth. I had help, she smirked gently. We all have help, but very few people become help. I didn't know what to do with the warmth those words sparked, so I simply patted her arm and headed for the stage. The courtyard was packed. Cameras from every major network lined the back rows. Local politicians in tailored suits stood off to the side. A marching band from a nearby high school waited for their cue. And at the very front, sitting proudly in a winter white coat, was Eleanor Calloway. She gave me a small nod as I walked past her. The silent signal she reserved only for moments that mattered. But it wasn't her who stopped me in my tracks. It was who stood in the back. My son. My daughter. Daniel wore an old navy peacoat buttoned all the way up like he was trying to disappear into it. Lily held a paper cup of cheap coffee, both hands wrapped around it like it was the only warm thing in her life. They looked smaller than I remembered, and for the first time in a long time, painfully human. I forced myself to look away and walk to the podium. The microphone felt heavier than I expected, or maybe it was just the memory of who I used to be the last time I stood in front of a crowd. A man discarded, trembling in a fog-drenched park, coatless and unwanted. I took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere years deep and began. 1 year ago tonight, I said, my voice steady, I was thrown out of the only home I'd ever known. A ripple moved through the crowd. A few cameras zoomed in. I stood on the front steps of my own house with one suitcase and nowhere to go. Not because I had failed a job, not because of addiction or illness, but because the people who should have loved me didn't. Silence rippled outward, thick and electric. And in that moment, I continued, I learned something I never wanted to learn. That sometimes the people you build a life for will build a life without you. I paused. Let that truth settle. But I also learned something else, something I didn't expect. My throat tightened, but I didn't look away from the crowd. I learned that real family isn't DNA. Real family is the stranger who sees you when you feel invisible. Eleanor bowed her head slightly. I felt my chest warm. Real family is the hand that reaches for you when you have nothing left to give in return. I gestured to the building behind me. 4 stories of glass, redwood, light, and hope. That is what this place is. Second home. A hand reaching out to people on the edge. To parents sleeping in cars. To veterans forgotten by the system. To children who have learned the word eviction before they learned how to spell their own names. The wind shifted. A child coughed somewhere in the crowd. The cameras leaned in. And today, I said quietly, we tell every person who walks through these doors the words I needed to hear most on the night I lost everything. I swallowed hard, feeling that night like frost on memory. You are not disposable. You are not alone. You are home. Applause erupted, loud, rising, swelling, as if the building itself breathed with relief. People stood. Some cried, some clapped with both hands raised. But I didn't look at them. I looked at the back. At Daniel. At Lily. Daniel's shoulders shook once, tiny, barely noticeable. Lily's hand covered her mouth, her eyes shining. I didn't smile, didn't frown. I simply met their gaze for a single heartbeat longer than comfort allowed. A quiet acknowledgement of everything we had been and everything we would never be again. Then I stepped down from the stage. The governor cut the ribbon. The marching band struck up. Children rushed forward with flowers and laughter. And I walked, slowly, deliberately, through the parting crowd toward the new building's entrance. Dad? Daniel's voice cracked behind me. I kept walking. Please, Lily whispered. My pace didn't change. Not fast, not angry, just forward. Their hands never touched me. They didn't deserve to. I approached the redwood doors of second home. They opened automatically as I stepped forward. Warm light spilled out across the concrete, golden and inviting. I crossed the threshold, and for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. Not out of hatred, not out of pride, but because some doors are meant to stay closed, and some are meant to open only once. Inside, a little boy in a Spider-Man jacket tugged my sleeve. Are you the man who built this place? He asked. I knelt so our eyes were level. I'm one of them, I said. He handed me a tiny dandelion, wilted, imperfect, but offered with pure sincerity. This is for you, he whispered, because you gave us a home. My throat tightened. I closed my hand gently around that fragile flower, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I smiled like a man who finally understood his place in the world. Outside, the celebration roared on. Inside, life began, and the boy's hand slipped into mine as if he'd always known it belonged there.